I don't want around your neck.
Might be useful.
Yes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me? I beg your indulgence. Before I start my story of my personal youth and what occurred to me and my family, I'd like to give you a short outline of Jewish history and the events that led up to what occurred 75 odd years ago. We are an ancient race that occupied, from the time of Abraham, the land of Canaan, which was divided between 12 tribes, who eventually made their way to Egypt during a time of a drought. There were shepherds and farmers who couldn't support themselves and their families. So they went to Egypt, which was prosperous, and in Egypt they multiplied and became quite numerous. When Egypt was on the brink of a 7-year famine, you may have heard of Joseph, who became Pharaoh's advisor and created storehouses and for grain during the 7 fat years. He knew that after the fat years there would be lean years, and so consequently he was instrumental in saving the Egyptian people from starvation. In the process, the Jewish people became quite numerous, as I said, and the Pharaoh of the time, later on Ramses II, became rather worried because he was waging war against the Hittite, the Iron Age warriors who were from Anatolia. And he was afraid that the Jewish people would join the Hittites and overcome the great power which Egypt was at the time. So he enslaved the people, the Jewish people, and they were forced to become slaves and build the cities of Pithom and Ramses. And they stayed in captivity till they were rescued by Moses and went into the desert, and under the leadership of Joshua reconquered the land of Canaan. In actual fact, I think when God asked him where he would like to go, he meant to say California. But he had a risk, and so God misunderstood and sent him to Canaan. They reconquered the land from the indigenous population. Jericho was a well-established city of 7,000 years at the time. The Israelites of the time managed to break through the walls. It's another story. And eventually, when these local people saw that the mighty city of Jericho fell, they capitulated, and Hebrew kingdoms were established. This kingdom was very important in the ancient world, same as it is today. It is the crossroads between the major civilizations of the time, between the Assyrian civilization, the Mesopotamian, Babylonian civilization, the Egyptians, the Persians, and so on. And whoever controlled this area, this strip of land, today we call it Israel, controlled the trade of goods moving from the Middle East to Europe and vice versa. So when you control a section of a roadway and you're able to accommodate the people passing through by giving them food, accommodation, water, and so on, you become wealthy. And the result was that all the great empires of the time, up to recently, wanted to take control of this area in order, whoever controlled it, of course, had the power. So the Jews of the time became warriors, strong, very independent, and very brave, because they had to fight back against the various people who were bent on conquering the country. The consequence was when eventually they were defeated by the Greeks and the Persians and the Babylonians. There were various expulsions, and they were taken into captivity, and eventually, of course, they managed to get the freedoms. And so consequently, Jews became spread throughout the world, known world, including China. There was a city up to recent time in China called Kaifeng, which was a Jewish city. So as they were dispersed throughout Europe, for example, people that are dispersed and become refugees have to work a little bit harder than the indigenous population. In consequence, if they don't work harder at whatever they're doing, they go under. So if you work harder, you have to establish yourself and you become successful. This, to a great extent, causes jealousy, greed, envy, and all the ills that humanity suffers from. We call it today anti-Semitism. The first known instance of anti-Semitism was actually documented in York, in this country. The Jewish population was herded into Kivitz Tower and set alight by virtue of the fact that the local squire couldn't pay his debts back to the Jewish community. But consequently, there followed an expulsion. The Jews were invited back, and under Henry the Hammer, again expelled when he couldn't pay his debts. Bearing in mind the Jewish people were restricted to money lending, collecting taxes for the king, and so on. They were not allowed to become landowners. Their trades were not required. Only very few trades were they allowed to pursue. Eventually, under Cromwell, they came back and were more or less given privileges of tenure. The same occurred in Europe. The various princes invited Jews in, and eventually they turned on them. For example, in Poland, King Kazimierz, the country was very backward and very poor, and he realized that the Jewish people would be a bonus. So the Poles invited the Jewish people to come and settle in the country, and they did very well for Poland and for themselves. And eventually, they became envious of them, and the church blamed the Jewish people for deicide, nobility, put their problems on the Jews, and so they forced anti-Semitism and persecution. This went throughout Europe. In fact, the only areas that where Jews were welcome and not persecuted were the Far East, India, Burma, and so on. Europe became a difficult place for Jews because when they were expelled from one country, they had to flee to another country. In the meantime, they were murdered, killed, or whatever. And in the Ukraine, where Chernivtsi pogroms occurred, thousands were slaughtered, the women were raped, and so on. And that instigated the great exodus from Europe to America, and to this country, and to the Western world. After that, of course, what is well documented is the Spanish Inquisition. Again, Jews were obliged to flee, and some came to this country, they were obliged to convert, and so on. This method of anti-Semitism, or continuation of anti-hatred and so on, eventually led to the Holocaust as we know it. So, Jewish hatred, which was endemic in among quite a lot of people, fostered to a great extent by the church and the nobility, and by the lower classes who were envious, resulted in the greatest horror, the greatest crime committed against our people, also against other people who did not conform with the idea of perfect master race. So I come to my story. My parents were of German origin. However, my mother, I managed to ascertain her family originated in Spain before the Inquisition. They fled westwards and landed up in Germany. The last known residence in Germany was number 37 Meyerbeerstraße, Berlin. Eventually they moved to Poland. Grandfather became a doctor, a very fine doctor. This house was Nakel on the Netz, which is in the Prussian corridor. The family were loyal German citizens. Never thought that they would face the persecution that they did. My great-uncle, mother's uncle, served in the Prussian forces and won the Iron Cross for his bravery. He was an officer, a Prussian officer. Another distant cousin served on the Russian front in the First World War, distinguished himself, and eventually had to leave by virtue of the Nazi takeover. We had in the meantime opted to stay in Poland. Under the Versailles Treaty, when the First World War ended, parts of Poland were ceded back to Germany, and people were given the choice either to go back to Germany or to become Polish citizens, and my parents decided to become Polish citizens. So we lived in Upper Silesia, where my father bought a house. We paid 36,000 gold zloty for it in 1935 when we married my mother. They both had studied in Steinemühle, which is northern Poland, textile design and so on. Mother was one of 5 sisters. They were a talented family. She was very beautiful, very vivacious, and a lovely lady. Played the violin. My great-uncle who managed to escape to America, he played the cello in the Berlin Philharmonic, and he became a leading cardiologist in America. He got away with it because he left before the war started. one aunt of my mother's managed to get away to Palestine with her husband because her husband was a major seed exporter from Poland, and they had money abroad, so they were able to buy themselves out early before the problems really set in. Our house in Katowice, which, as I said, was Upper Silesia. We spoke German at home. My maid was a Polish lady, and she spoke with a local dialect, Ślązak dialect, and I learned to speak Polish with this dialect, which helped me in the future to survive. I did not speak with a Yiddish dialect. We didn't speak Yiddish at home. And I was able to converse fluently in Polish. So, my father's business, they established a business in Katowice, in the house that we lived on the ground floor. Second and third floors were our living quarters. Fourth floor was the maid's quarter. She was a lovely lady, my maid. Always remember her wearing a white pinafore, starched and crackling. Came about when the Germans marched in. We watched them come through the town, German troops following a band, and they were singing an old German marching song. My mother was not afraid of them because she was German. I wasn't afraid of them because I had no fear of anything. I was a young boy. And we watched them marching through the town, and we thought, well, they can't be so bad. Everything will be all right. Bearing in mind that earlier, in the 30s, there were pogroms in Poland also, where there were calls to boycott Jewish shops. Jews were being beaten up in the streets, windows smashed of Jewish enterprises and synagogues. So this was already going on in Poland, and it was a favorite sport of the Polish lower classes to get the wages on Friday, go to the pub and get drunk, and then go Jew baiting, called hunting Jews so that whom they could beat up or abuse or whatever. This was a national sport, unbelievable. But it was encouraged by the nobility because the nobility felt that they were able to channel the hate of the lower classes onto another section of society, taking the problem of their poverty away from themselves. 1939, we were expelled from our house. I remember sitting on suitcases on the train to Warsaw. Father was burning documents. I don't know what these documents were. Maybe they were deeds, maybe they were identity documents. I have no idea. We landed up in Warsaw in my great-grandmother's flat in the old city, old part of Warsaw, the old city, which eventually was surrounded by a high wall with barbed wire top, grass bedded into the wall at the top, and guards on the entrances, Germans and Latvians and Ukrainians, who came in and in the habit of beating people up and misbehaving themselves. They reduced our rations till eventually we were allowed 150 calories of food a day. People started dying of cholera, dysentery, various diseases. diseases, malnutrition. Bodies were lying in the streets like sacks of potatoes, but they wanted potatoes, so they were just bags of bones. Children and other people were in the streets begging for food, trying to make a life. I didn't feel hunger. I don't know why. I can't remember. Maybe my parents sacrificed their rations to me. Or maybe because we moved in with my grandmother, she still had some food. Because we moved into her flat, we weren't newcomers that were thrown into the ghetto with nothing, not even clothes to wear in the winter. So I was fortunate, and our flat seemed to bulge with people. My mother's three sisters were there, friends and so on, and it was quite full. Father was involved with a chap on the outside, friend. I'm not quite sure what the connection was, but they entered into food smuggling, and were bringing in food and weapons into the Warsaw Ghetto. And a chap on the outside who happened to be Jewish but living under Christian colors, married to a Christian woman, used to supply these goods. Things got progressively worse. My mother and father, by virtue of them speaking perfect German and so on, got quite a good job. First of all, they got a camp card, which was a card which allowed them to leave the ghetto under escort. And with this camp card, they were able to obtain work in a local German factory that recycled clothing. And the pay for this day's work used to be a bowl of cabbage soup, water with a few cabbage leaves floating in it, and a piece of bread. Mother approached the factory owner, and she either bribed him or persuaded him to allow me to come out with them and work in the factory. And so I got also this bowl of soup after a day's work. I was clearing up the floor, sweeping out dirty bowls of cloth, picking up needles, making myself useful. And I got a bowl of soup and a hunk of bread, black bread. If you waited to the end, you might be able to get a bit thicker soup because there was a bit of nourishment in the bottom of the pot. However, you risked not getting any because when the pot was empty, you didn't have any soup. If you started at the top of the queue, then you did get the soup, but it was all water. So it wasn't that much of a nourishment, but I did get some nourishment, and so we survived one way or another. My mother and father made arrangements. They realized that there was no future for me in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they couldn't leave the great-grandmother, who was 84, and grandmother and other members of the family. They couldn't get away from them. But they made arrangements for me to be smuggled out, to leave the ghetto, and to go into hiding in the countryside. And as it was, one day, as I was going down the street in my best bib and tucker, under armed escort, as you can see, my mother told me when we got to a special corner, the guard in the front was looking forward. The one in the back couldn't see what was going on. My mother said, "Go." And I made a dash out of the column Höhe, calling in the middle of the road, and shot round the corner, and good as his word, my father's colleague, Mr. Fiolkowski, whose real name was Schreitman, was waiting for me. And he took me onto a barge on the river Vistula, which runs through Warsaw. And I went into the scuppers, where he left me with a couple of onions, a loaf of bread, and a flask of coffee, and promised to come back and collect me when he had made arrangements that would take me out. Good as his word, he came back a few days later. I didn't have a watch. I couldn't tell how many days had gone by or how long I had been down there in the scuppers in the darkness. Could have been 2, 3 days, could have been 1 day, I don't know. And we then made our way on a local train to Grodzisk Mazowiecki, where he and his family lived. A little village in the Mazurian woods, 35 odd kilometers northwest of Warsaw. The house was on the outskirts of the village. It was a semi-detached. The back of the house was actually a stonemason's house, and the stonemason was a local stonemason who worked on the gravestones because there was a graveyard across the road. I was introduced as a distant cousin of a family that had been bombed out in Łódź, called Lodz today, Łódź, and his wife, Janina. She was Catholic, a wonderful lady, brave, and I had 2 children, and the children accepted me as family. However, I didn't have any documents. On the train coming there was a search like on every time the train went through, but the Germans didn't bother me. They didn't ask for my documents. After all, I was a little Polish lad, dressed as a Pole and so on, and they didn't bother to question me. I was fortunate. The Germans were always accompanied by Polish renegades who were called Smalkowniks. They were Jews or Poles who, for the extra ration or whatever, would hunt down Jewish people and point them out to the Germans. The Germans couldn't identify Jews except very Orthodox Jews, but normal, everyday type of Jew they couldn't identify. So these people went around the countryside looking for Jews and betrayed them. And me, speaking wonderful Polish and all the rest of it, got away with it, and I was never questioned, and I was never pointed out, and I landed with his family. The daughter, Genofeta, Jania, was a very gentle soul, and the son was blonde, blue-eyed, was a bit of a monster, but we'll come to that later. The first year we had a wonderful Christmas. I remember I got a little chocolate figure, a racing driver on a motorbike. That was my Christmas present. We had a beautiful tree with globes and splattering candles in the dining room. There was even a fairy on top of the Christmas tree, I remember. The son got first skiing boots, and the daughter got a doll. And we celebrated Christmas with a glass of cherry brandy which Janina had made herself from the cherry tree that we had in the garden. and there was food on the table. And the reason that we did so well was because Mr. Schreidman or Mr. Filkowski, he worked for the local Gestapo commandant as his driver. Of course, the German didn't know that he was Jewish. Mr. Filkowski was a fantastic man, one in a million. He was a typical Polish officer, iron grey hair, upright, proud man, with riding boots up to the knees, which I took great delight in polishing for him. And he worked as the local Gestapo commandant's driver. He used to come home Friday nights with loot that he managed to liberate from the Germans. Sometimes ration cards, sometimes work permits, sometimes identity papers which would be then forged. Occasionally the pistol 9 Luger pistol, ammunition, and so on. He was at the same time the leader of the local Jewish partisan group that operated in the local woods. And he used to come home on Fridays, and he was a wonderful provider. We even had a piglet in the cellar under the kitchen. It was forbidden to have a piglet. It had to be given up to the Germans. We had a radio, for which the punishment would have been death. We had a radio and strung up an area as a washing line. We brewed illicit vodka, where I used to stick the labels on in the cellar, which was exchanged for bread, so we were doing very well. We even manufactured cigarettes from homegrown tobacco, and again, I used to fill the cigarette and put it into a packet, and he'd sell it. This man, not only was he a provider, but on his weekends home, he taught me how to survive. He taught me never to expose myself, but if I had to do it surreptitiously in case I exposed myself. Not only did I learn the Catholic prayers in Latin, so that I could blend in with the local children, but I also learned to swear. My language became the absolute dreadful language of a Polish street bandit. I could match every word for word. I became a really Polish street boy, because should I have had to confront any of them, a good little Jewish boy didn't speak the language that I spoke. Not even an Irishman, Irish builder would have used the language that I used. He taught me this. It was wonderful. He taught me how to make snares for rabbits, how to cook nettle soup, and to make nettle soup, which I made for the swill for the pigs. He taught me, in fact, how to survive. He taught me a smattering of Russian, because he said, they will come, and you have to be able to communicate with them, and you will survive. The dream came to an end. Before that happened, we dug an escape route for me through the garden, under the back fence, where I could drop into some trenches from the First World War, make my way across the road and into the woods. So, because quite periodically we had searches from the Germans who were looking for Jews, who were looking for weapons, anything that was forbidden. So I used to see them coming out of the town, about a kilometre away, and as soon as he saw the van, the lorry come with the troops, out and gone. Interesting. Wonderful life for a young man, young boy that I was. Sometimes, before he was killed, a Polish couple up the road took in a young Jewish couple with a baby, took the money from them, and betrayed them to the Germans. The price on a Jewish head was 1,000 zloty, which was barely enough to buy a shirt. That same night, the Germans came and killed the Jewish people. I watched them bury them. I heard the firing. I went to investigate, and I watched them bury near their garden, the couple and the babe. When Mr. Fiałkowski, who I used to call uncle, came back on Friday, I told him what happened, and he said, "Don't worry, we'll sort them out." And he gave his orders to his men, and they came in from the woods and finished the Polish off. I was greatly gratified. A while later, the house was surrounded by a group of young men wearing leather coats. We thought it was a Gestapo, that the game was up. They'd just come home. They herded us. One chap stayed in the road. They drew submachine guns and stopped us leaving. One went into the back. I couldn't get away. So we thought, well, that's it. Our day has come. And they herded us into the sitting room, where they pronounced sentence of death on Mr. Fiałkowski, my uncle, and in front of his wife and daughter, they really hooked him with machine gun fire and pistol fire. His wife threw herself in front of him, but it was too late. The daughter was screaming, the mother was screaming. I was left cleaning up the mess. And the irony of the situation was that the Germans gave Mr. Fiałkowski a military funeral because they thought he was a loyal Pole to them. And he was buried in the German part of the cemetery, and they fired a volley over his grave. And I sat on top of the wall in the cemetery and I watched this. And I thought to myself, I can't believe this. They would have killed him out of hand had they known that he was Jewish. But there you are. This is the irony of the situation that occurred. Things became very difficult for us. I became the main provider for the family of origin. I started running with the local yobs, street thugs, and became one of them. We robbed the farmers of the odd potato. Local farmer's wife set a bulldog on us because we had been scrapping apples. And we decided to teach her a lesson. I went back to the workshop and made a zip gun, and then we lay in wait for her and fired at the poor cow that she was taking out to pasture. The cow took off, dragging this old woman behind her on a chain. She screaming in pain, and the cow galloping away with a shaft sticking out of its rump. She never troubled us again, so we were able to scrap the odd turnip and the odd potato. And things became extremely difficult. Hunger, deprivation. I couldn't go to school. I stole a chicken, I killed it, and I was at the age of 8, and Janina cooked it. I trapped rabbits, and gradually I made myself quite useful. The son, in the meantime, was a blonde, blue-eyed, joined the Hitler Youth, and one day he was home, the mother was out, I heard screaming from the bedroom. I ran into the bedroom to see what was going on, and he was raping his sister. She was 12 at the time. I tried to pull him off her, and from my efforts I received tremendous blow to the head, smashed me against the wall, and he carried on with what he was doing, but I wasn't conscious anymore. On another occasion, he was stealing from his mother whatever he could in order to buy cigarettes. He stole curtains, he stole a few eggs that I managed to procure and claimed that I had stolen them, and so on. He claimed the curtains. Of course, I wouldn't steal those curtains. I was the culprit. The result was that I got a hiding of my life with a cat o' nine tails, which he administered. The cat o' nine tails, for those who don't know what it is, it's a goat's foot with 9 lead weights on the end. He opened my back. And every time he stole, I was culprit. Eventually, I ran away. But I couldn't go to my favorite hiding place, which was actually a crypt in the local cemetery, where I had taken refuge on an occasion because I knew the Poles wouldn't come at night. They were superstitious, and I was safe in there. So I used to roll the stone back, crawl into the crypt, and I would be safe there. I learned from Mr. Fiolkowski about mushrooms and berries and what to eat and what not to eat, what was edible. Winter time came, collected leaves, put them in sacks, stacked them up against the bungalow wall for the hard Polish winters. We had a winter where the temperature dropped down to 45 degrees minus. We couldn't leave the house. And there were Siberian wolves howling outside the door. That's how cold it was. That was a time that our dear friend the Germans got their defeat in Stalingrad. Wonderful, absolute magic. We listened to the news, which came from Radio London. And before the news was read, it sounded, this was a sound. Pop-pop-pop-pom. Pop-pop-pop-pom. This is Radio London. And we got the real news of what was going on in the world. It was wonderful. Anyway, so I couldn't go back to my crypt because Janina knew where I would have been, so I hid in a haystack. And in the morning, they found me, and instead of getting me beaten, they took me home and gave me a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. No more beatings. But he found my Jewish star at the bottom of the cupboard. And he started dragging me off to the Germans in order to get the bounty. A Carmelite nun I had met previously, some while before, had befriended me and taken me back to her garret room. And when she fed me, she realized how I was doing. She was a kind lady. And she gave me a stick grenade, which I kept in my pocket, which the Polish army had left with her. And she said, if I'm caught, At least I've got a chance at taking some of them with me. This grenade I carried throughout the war, and I had it in my special pocket down my trousers. And as Henrik was dragging me up the street, I pulled the grenade and I said, okay. And I unscrewed the cap, ready to pull the pin. And I said, I die, you die. A lot of them will die. Come on, let's go. Oh, no, 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 I was only joking. You are my brother. Another occasion, he again did this. He pinioned my arms and started taking me up the street. And I couldn't get at my hand grenade. And I said to him, that's okay, I'm coming. But I'll tell them that you're Jewish. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're Jewish. He said, no, I'm not. I'm. I said, go and ask your mother. And he said, you're lying and all the rest of it. He told me. He went to see his mother. And what's he talking about? What's he talking about? She said, yes, your father was Jewish. And that's when he realized that his sister had been sent off to a convent because she was beginning to look Jewish, develop Jewish looks, Semitic looks. And when he learned that he was Jewish, he would have died too, and his family would have died. He tried to commit suicide and jumped off a local bridge and just broke his leg, fortunately. Unfortunately, it would have been better had he broken his neck. But there you are, he didn't. I'm coming to the end of my story. 1945, we heard guns in the distance. By this time, things were very bad for us. We were starving. The fields were bare, nobody had anything to eat, and so on. So we were literally stripping bark of the trees and eating seeds from grass and whatever to sustain life. We heard guns in the distance, but before that, because I was running with this mob of youngsters, one of the favorite sports that we undertook was jumping on the back of the train, of the caboose, and we would shovel the coal out. And when we shoveled the coal out, the German guard was facing forward, the coal used to fly down onto the track, and the rest of the boys used to pick this up, gather it, and we used to take it to the market and barter it for a slice of bread or whatever. So we got away with that one. As the as the Russians got nearer, we watched the Germans lay mines, mine telegraph poles, bridges, and so on. And then we heard the guns. They had positioned a couple of cannons commanding the road to Warsaw. Fortunately, the Russians came across country. And the morning before the Russians took Grodzisk-Mazowiecki, we lads went out and disarmed all these devices that the Germans had made. Not one culvert was blown, not one bridge went up, not one telegraph pole went up, nothing. We collected these things and they became toys. Unfortunately, some of the boys were killed in the end and lost limbs, but they were toys. The Russians came in. That same night they did a search. At night, the Red Army girls performed the Kazachok, the Cossack dance in the middle of Market Square. They played the accordion and drank, and there was great hostility in the town. And in the morning, speaking a smattering of Russian, I asked them to go with them, and they said, of course, you come with us. So I climbed on the back of the T-34, and with the first Mongolian soldiers went towards Berlin, and we caught up with a local Gestapo unit that was driving a little field piece in the next town, and they surrendered. The Russians took them prisoner, lined them up against the wall, and shot them down. And there was no mercy at the time. I must admit, they emasculated them. They cut off their private parts, robbed them of their watches and whatever have you, and then they cut off. It was a little bit unpleasant to see. I decided I wasn't fit for this sort of venture, and I made my way back to Janina on foot to Grodzisk Mazowiecki, where I stayed till I left for England in 1946, March 1946. Arrived here on the 26th of March in this wonderful country.